Hello, BookTube. I once again had errands to do, and so I once again took the chance of leaving my little Frida Bean behind and going out into the world without her. I'm trying to get her accustomed to the fact that that will occasionally happen and that it's not the end of the world. I leave her with treats, I leave her with food, I leave her with water. She has access to the back of the couch where she can look at the world, and I'm hoping that she's smart enough to get that soon I will be back. And of course, since I was out in the world doing errands, that involved books, because I ended up at the Brattle bookshop here in Boston, and I got a small pile of books that I don't need at all, but I thought I would show you, starting with this UK trade paperback of the Diaries of Frances Partridge. The size of this thing. Isn't that lovely? I mean, not... She was a society butterfly who was part of the Bloomsbury group, and she knew everybody, and she wrote a shelf full of books. I think the ones that resonated with the public the most were her diaries, a lot like Alan Bennett in that regard. And, well, let me see, what does the book say? One of the great British diarists of the century. This volume is edited by Rebecca Wilson. She was born in 1900, the daughter of a progressive mother and an architect father, whose friends included Henry James, Arthur Conan Doyle. After studying moral sciences and English at Cambridge University, she worked at Haywood Hill's Curzon Street bookshop in London, where she met everybody. It's at that bookstore that she met everybody. And her diaries during the war are especially evocative. Those I have read. But I haven't read all the rest of these. I haven't read the war diaries in context. She's got a wonderful eye, and she's also one of those diarists. I love diaries anyway. I keep a journal of my own. But there are all kinds of diarists, and one kind that I really like are the kind that are completely bald. They're completely naked in what they're writing. As far as they're concerned, they're writing down their thoughts. But there's another kind that I like as well. They're more artificial. They're what Frances Partridge was for her whole life, which is, I almost want to call them a public diarist. Someone who's writing their diary with an eye towards other people reading it, with an eye towards it being public. And that can sometimes make a diarist just unbearably self-conscious. But other times it brings out the best in a writer who, where you don't see that best otherwise in their other published work. And that's the case with Frances Partridge. So her diary is always entertaining to read. And I was happy to find it. This was, these were all absolutely dirt cheap. So, the next one, cute little thing that I've had before. I've had it and given it away, And it was recently on my mind because last year, I think, or maybe very early this year, I found at the Brattle a big 2-volume memoirs of the original Earl Grey, of Grey of Falodon, a 19th century, 20th century British poobah, political poobah, who was an indispensable part of the government during the reign of King Charles V, or King George V. Just forever. He was in government for a long time, and he was eloquent and personable, and wrote a very large number of books, including a mammoth bestseller about fishing. And I knew when I got that 2-volume biography of him that what I wanted, in addition to that, was a little thing called Falodon Papers. Falodon was the location of his home family seat, and he made a collection of little occasional speeches and addresses and whatnot. He collected them as a volume called Falodon Papers in, I think, the mid-1920s. And they include literary reminiscences. They include thoughts about being a public figure, about public life at the time, which do read like dispatches from an alien dimension now. And also bits and pieces about the natural world, birding and fishing and whatnot, which he loved with a passion. And when I was rereading that 2-volume biography, that 2-volume set of memoirs, I kept thinking, boy, I wish I had a copy of the Falodon Papers right here on the shelf, and I found a copy. So I don't have to worry about it anymore. I have that, and this one's in bad enough shape. It's got sun modeling on the front and the back that I'm pretty sure that if somebody asked me for a copy, I would probably find them one rather than send this. So this will stay in my collection. And then the next book is a charmer. It is a purely sentimental type thing. Once Upon a Time, I lived in Washington, D.C., here in the United States, for a good stretch of time. And I had a job that had nothing to do with books. And I knew a lot of wonderful people. And despite the fact that Washington is crushingly hot and humid in the summer, we had a wonderful time. It's a golden patch of memories for me. And I love reading books about the grand old life of Washington, D.C. I've shown a couple of them on this channel. I have a small collection of them that I just reread. I go back to them periodically. And I found one that I've never had before. Big, heavy thing, full of illustrations. This is by Everyday Life in Washington by Charles Pepper. Let me see if I can show you. Yeah, it's got illustrations all throughout. But son of a gun! I opened to Senator Allison of Iowa. That was unintentional, I assure you. But it's also got big. That's the Smithsonian Institution. When there was room around it, I got big pictures like that, photographs, and all sorts of things. And it's from 1900, so it's before anything in the world. It's before even what I would consider the glory days, the glorious height of a certain kind of Washington society, which took place under McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft. That sort of 10, 15 years was Washington at its most glittering before the war, before World War I, and before a change in the atmosphere that came about after Woodrow Wilson, when politics in America started to change, started to become more, well, I don't know quite the word. Poisonous is the first word that comes to mind. That's a little too simple. But one way or another, these handbooks, Charles Pepper was an old newspaper man, and then he did something with the State Department. I think he was a trade advisor or something like that at the State Department. He was a gad about Washington. He was all about Washington, knew everybody, talked to everybody, and everybody at the time that he was pulling this book together knew that he was doing that. You can see the remains. This is probably a 1900 reprint. The Brattle Bookshop is like that. You'll find stuff like this jostling cheek and jowl with Clive Cussler novels from last year. But he wrote a bunch of books, just a huge number of books. He was, in my opinion, a bad chooser of subjects of books. That's always frustrating because he's a very companionable writer. But you would the people at the time would learn that he was working on some new book, and they'd say, "Oh, well, what is it?" And he would say, the coal trade in Cuba. And you'd say, no, don't do that. And the one time that he ever really stepped out of that tedium of paper chasing and wrote a book for genuine public interest was this book. And it sold like the dickens. It was in every bookshop, every gift shop, all over the American South. The introduction to the book and the sentiment throughout is that Washington, the city, really is an education on its own, apart from anything that's happening in the buildings or the schools or anything like that. And although that's not as true now, Washington is a very closed city in a lot of ways now. Certainly the corridors of power are not open to the public. Once upon a time, you could take a tour of the White House, you could take a tour of the Capitol, and you could wander away from your tour and just end up somewhere you weren't supposed to be. And then someone would come along, a porter or even a senator would come along and tell you, you really should go back and rejoin your group. Now you'd be shot dead if you did that same thing. If you approached even the grounds of the White House, you'd be shot dead. And that would have been unthinkable to the people from Pepper's day or from later days. So, but in his day, the city was an education on its own. And he captures that really well. You will never see this book. I'm sorry. Half of my Brattle book hauls are just dispatches from the kind of a used bookstore that unfortunately a lot of people don't have access to. I've lived in places for many, many years where you didn't have access to anything like the Brattle Bookshop. Half these books, 2/3 of these books, are things that your own used bookstore probably would never have. And I regret that. It's good that there's at least a kind of alternative in the internet I mean, if you see something like this, if for some godforsaken reason you wanted a book like this, or this book in particular, or if you wanted the Faladin Papers, or if you wanted Francis Partridge's diaries, for instance, even in this is Phoenix Press. Now, this is a Phoenix Press paperback. You wanted any of those things, it's entirely possible that you could go online and simply buy them. Find someone who has a copy and get it. That's great. And that makes me feel a lot better about the fact that bookstores, wondrous places like the Brattle Bookshop, would have huge turnover, extremely reasonable prices, books from all eras, everywhere, in the sale lot, in the store, in the collectible shelf on the third floor. Though it used to be common, and now they're not common anymore, and it makes me feel a little better. I'm sad about that fact, but I'm a little enheartened by the fact that there is a kind of alternative. It's not one that I've ever had any luck with, or that I particularly enjoy. But anyway, the next book is something that I trusted the Brattle would provide. I always say that. I say the Brattle will provide, because they are constantly buying, and they have a vast stuffed basement full of the produce of those buys that are always gradually making their way up to be priced, and a great deal of them go out to the sale lot next door to the store for $3, $5, and $1, and a great lot of them go to the store, to the shelves, where they're not that much more expensive. So I have seen this book. I've had crappy trade paperbacks of it. I've had slightly better trade paperbacks of it. I've had all sorts of stuff. And all along, I knew that sooner or later the Brattle would provide me with a completely clean, like new, dust-jacketed hardcover. And that until Penguin Classics makes a classic of it, that I could get. And all I would need to do is wait. And lo and behold, it happened. It's the Collected Stories of Eudora Welty in a beautiful, brand new hardcover with a dust jacket. No rips, no tears, no nothing. Just ready to be reinforced and used. That is our wonderful author. And all I had to do was wait. So I grabbed it, and it was $1, so it was fine by me. And then the last book that I got in this impromptu Brattle book haul is a kid's book. It's by Henry Marion Hall, and it's Woodcock Ways. It's a big, oversized kids book, illustrated by Ralph Ray. And I confess, I love stuff like this, books like this. But the reason, one of my own kind and a rather unfortunate woodcock, the reason I would get a 70-year-old kid's book was for Ralph Ray. It was for his illustrations. He was an amazing illustrator. In this book, he works in color and in black and white. And the book, I'm sure, will be good. I'm sure that it will have lots of great natural history. There's a fox after a woodcock. But the reason I got it really was for Ralph Ray, because he's an incredible nature illustrator, especially an incredible bird illustrator. Just his work, his best pieces are in museums. He did a prolific amount of work, though, not just full color pieces that are in museums, but also illustrations of books like this that he did by the bucket load. And he's just extremely talented. His pictures are so wonderful. It makes me a little sad when I see a book of his. I'm hoping that Woodcock Ways, I'm hoping that it making an appearance at the Brattle sale carts means that there's a bunch of other stuff coming. I'll keep an eye out and grab it all, especially since leaving the house doesn't appear to cause the world to end. That's always a nice thing to know. But it's a little melancholy because he died young. He did a prolific amount of work, almost as if he knew that his time was limited. I think he died in his mid-30s, with a whole lifetime of artistic development ahead of him. And it wasn't just nature that he did. He did a whole bunch of other things too. He was always working, constantly working, and his work is always good. I can spot it a mile away, and I always love it when I see it. So I was overjoyed to see this thing. I'm if I dare to leave the house again soon, I will go back and prowl around the oversized books a little more closely to make sure I didn't miss another one, because there were a couple of others. He did The Ruffed Grouse as another book in this Oxford series that I would love to have, even though I'm not sure I could pick a ruffed grouse out of a police lineup. But anyway, there you go. So that was a little impromptu Brattle haul. There was Woodcock Ways. Sorry, this is also a quintessentially Brattle book haul in that you will see things like the Collected Stories of Eudora Welty that you see everywhere. Yard sales, flea markets, used bookstores. And then you see a bunch of stuff here that you won't see anywhere except at the Brattle. So we have the Collected Stories of Eudora Welty. We have Faladin Papers by Earl Grey. We have Everyday Life in Washington. A wonderful old book of a Washington that's long gone by, full of illustrations and pictures of statesmen who no one remembers, buildings the way they don't look anymore, and then the diaries of Francis Partridge, who was a gadabout, and this covers from 1939 to 1972, and it's going to be fun to read. It's going to be fun to read the whole of it from start to finish. I'm a sucker for diaries, and one of the people that she knew, one of the literary luminaries that she knew, was Raymond Mortimer, who was a fantastic book critic forever and ever. I think for the New Statesman. He wrote for anybody. He wrote for anybody that would write him a check. And amassed a gigantic body of book reviews. And once again, as I've said on this channel a few times, as far as I know, they're not collected. If there might be a selected Raymond Mortimer out there, not in print anymore, but the whole body of what he did, and in his case, writing in the early part of the 20th century, they're books that you would know. They're books that aren't unnecessarily obscure. I wish that they were collected. I wish that they were available somehow, but probably 90% of them have rotted away, uncopied in any way. Just the copies of the newspapers pulped and gone. That's a bit of a shame. I'm glad that the internet adds a tiny measure of protection against that for working book critics today. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. That's a Brattle book haul for you, and I'll be back soon. Thank you, BookTube.